it's almost like the government is like a dog walker. It's the person walking a bunch of dogs. And the path that it's on is like the price path of the economy. And the dogs, can orbit around the person who's moving. They can go, all around them, right? With limited by the tether, which is like the institutional structure. In order for like the whole orbit to like move forward, that person has to move. They're the one holding the leash. The leash is. So if they want to move beyond the maximum, the range of the leash, the person has to move. And so to me, that is a good sort of way to put it all together.
Welcome to Activist MMT, a podcast about real-world economics, including modern money theory, and how life changes when you discover it. I'm your host, Jeff Epstein. Today's part 2 of my 2-part conversation with Charles Hayden. In part 1, Charles described how he created at least 3 important milestones in MMT history, and how Warren Mosler played an integral role in his journey to understanding and accepting MMT. Today in part 2, we discuss some of the many varied realistic views of inflation, and how each of them is connected by the fact that the national government is the monopoly price setter for the entire economy, whether they know it or not. This is one of the unique contributions of modern money theory. The first realistic view of inflation is how it's not a disease or a symptom, but rather a measurement of some prices going up somewhere in the economy for some reason. It's not possible to know what the problem is without going out into the real world and discovering them for yourself. If you address those real world problems, then those prices will naturally go down, which will in turn result in a lower measurement of inflation. This is not unlike how a thermometer measures the temperature of a sick person. The rabid desire to lower inflation is not unlike dunking the thermometer into a cup of ice and ignoring the actual sickness of the actual patient and doing nothing to help them. This is the idea behind lowering inflation by raising interest rates. If we lock all of the starving people out of the kitchen, then we can truthfully say that everyone who enters this kitchen gets a good meal. These are all examples of how real costs are pushed by those with the most onto those with the least, and subsequently onto the families and communities in which those people exist. The second realistic view of inflation is the class conflict theory of inflation. This is as originated by Marx and adopted by MMT. Inflation is essentially a battle between business owners and their workers, where one side fights to increase their profits and the other to increase their wages. A wage price spiral can only happen if we allow it to happen. The only way it can stop is if one side is empowered enough to prevent the other from pushing back. More broadly, this is the centuries-long battle between rich and poor to increase their power over the other. In all the above cases, outside of natural catastrophe, the government must be complicit in order for the inflation to persist. Currently, the government is essentially entirely on the side of the rich, business owners, and capitalists. So in almost all cases, all real and financial costs are borne by workers and the poor. The idea that the government is the monopoly price setter essentially means to me that we as a collective are in control of our own destiny. The government is us as a collective. We have let it decay into the morass that it currently is. We have let the leash out way too far, and now it's going to take a whole lot of effort in order to rein it back in. Regardless, no matter how unlikely or even impossible the task may be, if we are to survive, there is no alternative. Outside of natural disaster, everything we do and don't do is a choice. We are choosing to go extinct. We could choose to not do that. And now, let's get right back to my conversation with Charles Hayden. Enjoy.
That's got to be one of the hardest jobs in our economy right now. Is teaching these kids with COVID, with the shootings, with the insanity, with the standardized testing. So, yeah, I can't say enough good things about Melanie and John too. John's a great human being.
All right, so let's move on. So I'd like to describe. So I just spoke with John. Not just. I spoke with John maybe a month ago, month and a half ago.
I watched the two. I was waiting to do Jonathan's interviews with him. I haven't done that yet, but I did the first two parts, and I heard the part you're talking about where he, became a bigger thing for you. He just kind of mentioned it in passing.
Cool. Yeah. So that's actually going to be released tomorrow. That's actually going to be released tomorrow, which is
okay.
Part 2, which is July 10th. So I want to briefly describe that. And I'm confident that, number one, I'm confident it's accurate. And number two, I'm confident that it does not conflict with what you want to get into, which is monopoly price setter.
Yeah.
So I want to say that, and then I want to get your thoughts on it, and then we'll transition into the monopoly price setter. So inflation is not, like you were saying that, and then inflation came up and now everybody's upset and whatever. And it's like, but their interpretation of what inflation is complete nonsense. So it doesn't really matter, this inflation that came up. It's basically, they decided to create this boogeyman. Really, it's not a real thing that they're fearing. I mean, yes, there are some real things going on, but what they're talking about is a boogeyman that is, if anything happens for, if we give it the poor what they need, then that's the inflation we fear, So what I understand inflation to be now is not a disease and not even a symptom. It's neither of those things. And when people talk about inflation, they consider it a disease. I think that the average person and the way that the media portrays it is that inflation is a disease that must be cured at all costs, no matter what.
Yeah.
And what it actually is it is a measurement of something going wrong somewhere. And we can't know what that is until we look into it. But people assume that it's like a thermometer in sickness. So if a thermometer shows a high temperature, yes, something is wrong somewhere. Your body is fighting off something. But that doesn't mean that, it's like the difference between, do you want the temperature to go down because you fear a high temperature? At all costs, make that temperature go down, or do you want to cure the sickness? If you want the temperature to go down at all costs, then just put the thermometer into an ice bath. and then the temperature will go away. Problem solved. And that's how people, I think, treat inflation. Make the inflation go away no matter what. Let's put that thermometer into an ice bath. Whew, now thank goodness inflation has gone away. Meanwhile, the person is still sick because you haven't cured what their actual temperature, what their body is fighting. And so I think there is a real disconnect between, you were saying, then inflation came up in 2021, and yes, it did, but the inflation that these people are talking about, that the people are fearing and that the media is blathering on about, is not real. It's a boogeyman that is essentially, we're threatening to give poor people stuff, and that's the boogeyman of inflation that we're talking about. So that is inflation to me. That is, it is the temperature. And if you want to really understand what the problem is, then you need to go to that person and diagnose what's wrong with them and then solve that problem. But we're so busy just dipping the thermometer into an ice bath. And that's basically, raising interest rates and whatever. Yeah, it brings inflation down, but it's like, this kitchen feeds everyone, but we'll just shut a lot of people out. So but everyone who comes in this kitchen is going to get a great meal. But let's ignore the fact that we're shutting people out of this kitchen to begin with. So that was kind of, that wasn't as direct and concise as I wanted it to be, but I think I got my point across. So that's how I see what inflation actually is in a broad sense. I think that's accurate, and I'm pretty sure that it's compatible with Warren Mosler's view that the inflation is essentially, a function of the monopolist being the monopolist price setter, and it's also compatible with class conflict. It's a class conflict theory of inflation, which workers fight for higher wages, and capital fights for higher profits, and government stands in as a guard dog for capitalists, which is why they always win. But I think all of these things fit together. All of these things are compatible with each other.
Yeah. Well, what? All right. I'd be remiss if I didn't push back on something you said about higher rates equal lower inflation. No.
Well, okay. I didn't. That's not what I meant. Say what you're going to say. That's definitely not what I meant. I'm saying that is the equivalent of sticking a thermometer into the ice bath, and then they're raising interest rates is their version of getting rid of inflation at all costs by simply sticking a thermometer into an ice bath without solving the real problem.
They've confused the hot stove with the ice bath.
Yeah.
They're like, wow, this thing's hot again. I don't understand it.
Right.
But so, all right. And this is the way I like to say it, to not just be polite, but to be fair and charitable with people that maybe I don't agree 100% with how they're saying it. But and I will say this, like, the way Warren talks about inflation is different than how Randy Ray and Bill Mitchell, and you can find other things in their writings where they sort of differ. But this is almost, Warren is I think it gets muddled, in my opinion, by academics, possibly because the way that Warren says it is really hard for people to understand. And you're up there in a conference, you're dealing with laymen, they're not going to get it. You might as well just avoid it and say something that's a little bit, easier for them to get, but it is we are missing out on stuff, and it not just things for the purposes of analysis, rhetorical, political opening by avoiding the way Warren says it. But inflation is the government has to pay higher prices when it spends or lends in order for there to be inflation, right? It has to make the currency easier to get. It's paying more for the same stuff. Now, all kinds of prices can be changing, and inflation could be stable. Class conflict could be going on. Inflation still could be stable. There's redistribution and all this stuff, reordering in the private sector. All that could still be happening, and inflation could be stable. And then other times, those things lead to sellers going to the government, raising and demanding higher prices. And we've got to start really looking at the government procurement and contracting process, because the way they built inflation into that process through schedules of prices in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. These things are fixed, well in advance of that spending, and some of it's anticipating increases. It's negotiated. Other times though, some of their price schedules are variable. It's linked to inflation, which indexing. So you don't. It's almost like a contracting and procurement process can almost. It's like it can leverage an existing inflation and make it worse, right? But and I think what I'm saying is important, and it's what we're missing out on, because you could have inflation without demand and supply being out of whack, just simply by the government choosing to pay higher prices. Congress could just legislate, like, all right, we're going to pay 5% more, for everything, and then prices would rise, right? And if you go back to the beginning of the money story, you're in the room with Warren. He's up here telling you what you have to do to get his tax credits. That's sort of a dictatorial situation, right? You're not negotiating, but we do sellers do negotiate with the government. There's a little bit of back and forth, and you could expand upon Warren's model. You could have banks, you could have like a real economy and people exchanging inside the room, and you would get to that place where there's people negotiating with the government to do the work that the government wants done, right? And the government being flexible and saying, okay, well, we'll pay you $1 more for this. And if people don't show up to do the work that government wants done, the government raises their price to attract those workers. So
or raises taxes.
Yeah, or forces you in, right? There's both those levers. And but if you go back to the money story and say there's beginning of time, no money, we just created a government. People value things in relation to other things. Without no money, no government, whatever, it's this relative price story where my coffee cup is worth two bottles of water in my head. Somebody else might say, oh, well, it's 3 bottles of water. And another, it's just 1 bottle of water. And then the stuff is exchanging, and it's our indifference levels that sort of like inform us when we make purchasing decisions in that sort of bartering world, right? And I don't like this. Like, I don't like implying that bartering came before governments. Like, governments have been with us since we've had organized groups, right? So as soon as there was 4 or 5 people in a room, there's been a government, right? Like, there's been some system of rules in place. But anyways, in my head, coffee mugs worth 2 water bottles. Somebody else it's 3, somebody else it's 1. But now government's coming in and applying its numeraire, and it has to give the private sector, the non-government, the information. There's no prices in terms of dollars yet, right? It has to set the price. It has to say, actually, the coffee cup is going to be worth $2. That's what we're going to buy these coffee cups for. We're going to buy them for $2. And it's like the things that the government pays for. One, we know that not everybody works for the public sector, right? Some people do the work to get the currency from the government, and then other people who need the currency have to basically work for the people who did work for the government.
Right. Like, you either work for the government, or you work for a company that works for the government, or you work for a company that works for a company that works for a government, which explains every job in the entire economy. Like a movie, a person that sells candy at the movie, they're selling to a judge. They sell candy to the judge who goes sees a movie. And so, there's always that chain.
Yeah. I mean, conservatives might have a problem with what you're saying, but Warren calls it demand. It's just demand filtering. It's just demand for money is filtered by these initial government contractors who are the ones who work and get the money from the government, and then these other people are coming to them. So it's like almost like pricing power is now, after the government has spent, pricing power is now shifted to this other group, the people who work for the public sector, and they're not gonna buy stuff. Their purchases, their relative values in their head is going to be informed by what they had to do to get the currency from the government. So the way I like to say it, it's like these other prices that are, things that government didn't buy, the stuff that we bought, it orbits around the prices that, the government pays when it spends. They orbit, but they can only go so far out of whack. And there's an analogy that I sort of came up with. And Warren, I'm not going to say that he endorses it. It's not bulletproof. It's going to cause people to get all hung up. So I don't know if Warren would say he endorsed it, but he did say he liked it. But it's almost like the government is like a dog walker. It's the person walking a bunch of dogs. And the path that it's on is like the price path of the economy. And the dogs, can orbit around the person who's moving. They can go, all around them, right? With limited by the tether, which is like the institutional structure. In order for like the whole orbit to like move forward, that person has to move. They're the one holding the leash. The leash is. So if they want to move beyond the maximum, the range of the leash, the person has to move. And so to me, that is a good sort of way to put it all together.
They have to choose to move.
They have to choose to move. Yeah. And that's the other thing. It's like, but the government doesn't set the price. It's just the sellers they're the ones that say it's $5 and the government, has to pay that. It's like, yeah, but they choose. They have to make the decision to spend. And if they don't, then what? What's the price then of an unsold good? But yeah, so like people, are all, it's the gouging and it's corporate irresponsibility. It's corporate gouging. It's causing inflation. And I'm like, I don't say that. Like, you can't cause inflation in the private sector, to me, right?
You can, but someone has to allow it to happen.
Yeah, you have to. It's still, there's this final validating step.
Yeah, and it's blaming the victim. It's blaming. I mean, in this example of the price gouging caused inflation. Okay, maybe you're probably right, but who allowed that price gouging to happen to begin with?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and it's part of the legislated institutional structure that has allowed them to do that, and then it's the government paying those prices. Validating it. So, but like I said, you don't necessarily need the sellers to come to the government and demand higher prices. The government can just say, you know what, hey, you're asking for $5 for this, we'll actually pay you $5.50. I mean, it's true. Like they do pay more. They have other, like, I don't know if you've taken any public administration classes, but there is some weird theories and ideology about how the government should spend, how it should do price discovery, and what, it doesn't want to interfere in the private sector processes, but it doesn't want to be biased, and and they're all but yeah, so now not everything in our economy is sold by someone subject to the coercive tax. You got foreigners, you got Saudis, and they want to save in our dollar, right? But that's a totally voluntary decision, right? And they have pricing power, but still, government has to spend. It has to choose to pay the higher prices for oil and gas, and
they have to do business with companies in the U.S. who have to pay their workers with dollars because those workers have to pay taxes, and that company has to deal with other companies that have to pay that worker.
That could drive a need for the dollar besides savings. Is that I forget how Rowan's saying it, but it's like a legal mediated demand or something for the dollar. So I don't have a problem with the way he says it. But anyway, like this part is like an aside to this theory, but the government is the largest consumer of oil on the planet. The U.S. military inside of that is the largest buyer of oil. So I don't know what's the term, monopsony or what?
Monopsony.
Yeah, like it's a large purchaser. It has pricing, power as a buyer. But the point is government still has to choose to pay those higher prices, and now it's faced with a horrible choice, right? If it doesn't spend, now the U.S. military can't move if it doesn't, buy the oil at these prices, right? We can't drive anywhere. We can't defend ourselves. We can't put down a rebellion. We can't enforce the tax code. And so there's limits to how much extreme austerity the government could do. But that is an option when you're facing inflation. The government could just come in and say, you know what, screw you guys. We're not paying 1 cent more for anything. And until everyone lowers prices, we're not going to spend a thing. And tax liabilities are in place. Government spending falls to near zero. Just it has to have some spending so it can sustain its power to enforce the tax, right? But immediately the economy needs the dollars to pay the tax bill. Dollars are not coming into it, and what do you think? They're all going to start cutting their prices, and the government couldn't do that if it wasn't the freaking monopolist. And so, like when people have a problem with people start saying, it's private sector's causing inflation. It's like they're undermining the money story where the government is the monopolist, the issuer, right? And they don't necessarily realize it. And again, I think this is because it's so kind of complicated. It's really hard for people to get. It takes way more than one conversation, I think, to get these points through. I was really hoping somebody would have created like a video by now with like some animations to help reinforce this. Go ahead.
I think it's actually rather simple. It's just so different than what people think. And it's complicated, especially by the government doesn't use its power. It passively delegates that power to the private sector. So it appears as if it's a price taker.
Yeah.
Because it is so passive and so neglectful. So it is a price setter. It is the monopoly price setter, but it does that very passively and indirectly by not providing Medicare for all, by not enforcing antitrust, by persecuting journalists, by protecting capitalists, and doing all of these things that it does. It is a price taker because it chooses to be a price taker. So in some cases, it directly sets prices for soldiers, for judges and representatives and whatever. But in a lot of cases, it just passively, it's just passive, and it neglects by not providing healthcare, by not providing education, by not negotiating pharmaceutical prices. It delegates that price setting power to the private sector and takes those prices. But of course, they're choosing to do that delegation. They're choosing to take those prices. They don't have to. So,
yeah, I mean, I don't really have a problem with that. I mean, the way Warren says it though is like if whether they know it or not, they're still setting prices, even if they're operating and they think of themselves as being a price taker. And
yeah, agreed. There's what I think really adds to the confusion, because they're choosing to allow their massive, immense powers lie fallow, including the military that they have, if it really comes down to it.
But this is also like, I could see why people are like, well, wait a minute, like I was trying to explain it to John. I was like, yeah, they could just set the economy on fire and not spend, and prices would fall. And he's like, holy shit, like what the hell? Why would you do that? And that's kind of the problem is that the measures that it would need to take to control inflation, and that's like some crazy serious bout of inflation, they'd have to burn everything down. And they're not going to take that step.
They are taking that step. They're just doing it in slow motion.
Yeah, very slow, right? But they're not, and back to my dog walker example, right? I've seen this, somebody walking the dog before, and the dog is walking the human. Now the human's feet, the body of the person still needs to move. It's got that leash, but they're being dragged. And weaker governments where there's corruption, where violence is part of how business is conducted, you could see how that those sorts of governments can be dragged. And are they setting prices? That's a language thing. So I can see why people say, oh, no, it's just too complicated. I don't want to, it's private sector. We're short, there's a shortage, and that's what's causing the inflation. But again, we don't know what all the prices are in the economy, right? Of things, final goods and services. We don't know. All we can do is estimate. And we have measures of estimation, benchmarks, CPI, right? But it's a look back. It tells you what's happened. And is that inflation? Is that what's happening now? Well, you'd have to look forward to kind of see what's happening now. You have to look at forward prices. And Warren's point is that that forward price rate is really determined by the interest rate. And so it's like the interest rate is the academic definition of inflation, assuming you're talking about what's going to happen. So that's why you're looking at forward pricing. But it's an estimate. It can be wrong. We put all these faith in these government statistics, and I'm not alleging that, they do a really good job. We have some of the best public information in the world, right? But they do revise these things. And we really don't have a good way of looking at what's going on in the economy right now. And, it's all a look back. There's a lag. We got to estimate. There's weird statistical methodologies they use, and they smooth out the data, and then it screws something else up later down the road. We got to fix that, blah, 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 blah. It's over my head. I'm not that deep into statistics, but a job guarantee would give us a more real-time measuring tool. That's not the intent of the job guarantee, but that's just an effect here. Is the economy's slowing down, something's going on because the line to sign up for the job guarantee is getting longer. Or, hey, we're doing really good. Look how few people are in line to get a job through the job guarantee. And that's a real-time sort of thing that, it allows the private sector to sort of optimize the government deficit. And we've turned government spending over really to the private sector based on their demand for people's labor. So the counter-cyclical spending is going to be more in tune with what's actually happening and require less human intervention and judgments to act. So, and one of I was terrified when COVID hit and 30 million unemployed in a matter of months. I was like, there is no way in hell all these people are going to get their job backs. And we already have a problem with long-term unemployment. It's going to get even worse. You got all these sick people. And now we're finding out about long COVID and all these subsequent variants. And we very quietly have, Biden has moved us into basically implemented Trump's policies, but, a little bit on the margins with some, he sent us testing kits and he rolled out the vaccine. Masking is less now a part of public life. And I just think they wanted to lower the temperature politically and get us off of fighting each other over COVID. And unfortunately, like a minority is just extremely loud and extremely vocal and violent about, public health interventions. And
the government is allowing it to happen.
Yeah, the government is allowing to happen.
And the government is allowing COVID to happen.
Yeah, it's still...
I saw a graph There was a graph of early on in the pandemic, and it was showing like areas of the country that, were red because it was really high growth of COVID and whatever. And then you see a graph from like 2 years later where all the colors are green because they changed the colors. So what used to be red is now green. So even though it's 5 times larger growth of COVID, they just chose to color it green. So the graph looks so much better.
It's so silly. But we're still in a pandemic. It's disruptive of people's daily lives. It prevents them from working, and then they're spending things, purchasing other items than they would have purchased if they didn't get sick. And we know the supply chain problems have gotten a lot better. But all it takes is a major outbreak, and the stuff's not coming in on ships. So we're still going to have these problems. And, the whole is inflation transitory. And Stephanie's point has been it was never based on time. It was conditional. And so long as these conditions are present, we're going to have this, transitory style inflation, which eventually will go away when these conditions are not present. But right away I was like, wait a minute. Energy prices. I knew that when the Saudis and the Russians were having their price war, and oil got down to negative prices in 1 month, I was like, holy crap, this is the cheapest oil is ever going to be in my life. But I know, the way a monopolist works, right, is they try to wipe out the competition, and they do it by undercutting price. And then as soon as the competition's gone, then they start raising their prices. And I was like, once our energy industry is just decimated, then we're all dependent on the Saudis again and the Russians, they're going to start raising their prices. And sure enough, they did. And it basically, as soon as, March of 2021, they started to move prices up. And even though we're not buying that much Saudi oil, we buy very little, it still affects, West Texas Intermediate and the Brent crude prices. They're going to trail those Saudi prices. And the world needs that oil. Even though we in the United States, we still haven't even got to the pre-pandemic gasoline consumption, but we're exporting, so many of these products. And, right now the price of gas is, because oil's gone down considerably, and the price at the pump has been going down. But our refineries, we lost 11 refineries in 2020. We haven't built one, supposedly, like a big refinery in 30 years or something. And we're not going to. They're not going to invest in this. This is a highly capitally intensive investment, ongoing costs in an industry that, government has growing hostility towards. Biden during the campaign was, I'm going to take on the oil companies. I'm not going to negotiate with them. I'm going to, vilifying them. And they are villains, but fortunately, we have not transitioned over yet. And
the price of oil has to go up. We have to have inflation with oil and energy. We have to. If we're going to survive, we have to. If we're going to start thinking of alternatives, we have to.
Yeah, and that'll reorder the price level, and we've got to adjust to it. And to your point about inflation, it affects people's real incomes, right? And I think the main two areas that got everyone pissed off is the price of gas and the price at the grocery stores. And, during the pandemic, there were shortages, but you didn't see rising prices. Everything was on back order. They just kept making the sale and then pushing delivery out into the future. And, it was only, like I said, once they started to raise the energy price, and then later on the shipping crisis, and the sellers had to pass those costs along. But it pisses people off. It has political implications. No freaking government wants to deal with this crap. And then it bleeds into this, curtailing the progressive agenda, because now they have their Empire Strikes Back moment where, aha, we told you, you said this, blah, blah, blah. And their solutions aren't solutions to inflation. Nobody's talking about inflation the way Warren does. And what I like about it, which should be, and what more moderate and conservative leaning people should like about it is government is front and center. It's like, yeah, government causes inflation. I tell these conservatives and moderates this stuff, and they're just, it confuses them. They think I'm some hippie and I'm quote unquote on the left. Why am I talking like this? And I don't like to think ideological. I want to think logically. I want to use reason and always check my assumptions. And I support working people, so I guess that puts me on the left. Whatever. I'm not a communist. I mean, I'm not. Sometimes I feel like that, but just ripping these rich people out of their houses, and when they piss me off. But yeah, you'd think that this sort of idea, putting the government front and center, might help us, expand and attract people that may otherwise not be as interested in MMT, because it sounds like some sort of socialist plot. And going all the way back to the first part of our discussion, when I was watching Warren at these Tea Party rallies, presenting himself as a Tea Party Democrat, and I was like, what the hell is that? But he's talking about cutting taxes, the payroll tax. And I was like, wait a minute, I thought this guy was some socialist communist. Communists like tax cuts now? What the heck? I don't understand. And it was that confusion, just, like I said, you can't get this stuff out of your head. If you have questions, they just bang around. And I'm very, very fortunate that I was able, for the time and place that I was in not just in my life, but what was going on in the world at the time. And, Facebook was still kind of new. But I'm very fortunate that I was able to reach out to Warren and have him explain this stuff to me directly, because I would not have got it without that more hands-on approach. I would be like these idiots on the internet who, MMT, and they sound all positive, but you start asking them questions, they're really undermining our cause because they haven't been taught properly, right? They've read what they've read, and secondhand, third hand, and they want to do great. They're it aligns with their political values. The Green New Deal, the job guarantee, but I like Warren's approach just towards MMT in general, in trying to keep So some of the activists got mad at him when talking about the Green New Deal, because, and also the job guarantee, because Warren wants to take out, quote unquote, the bleeding heart language and just present it in a way that a businessman will support and make it bulletproof. But also Warren thoroughly admits that approach hasn't worked. And it's what the activists online have, the language they've used and come up with, that have really spread this. And he's very congratulatory of the activists and thankful for them in using language that he wouldn't have used, to say some of these things, and negative side effects. I mean, I still think that his way is the more of the right way to do it. But, look, man, I mean, people are going to disagree. Like I said in the very beginning, Randy Ray and Bill Mitchell and Warren, there's things they still disagree on. And that's okay. No one person should have all of this figured out. I mean, they would probably die from the mental energy that would take. But it's okay to have, different opinions on different matters. That's totally normal. And we don't all need to use the same language, explain things the same way. But I do think the way that we were talking, the way that inflation was presented pre-March 2021, kind of set us up for failure, set us up for this counterattack, this Empire Strikes Back moment. Because there's just way too much, like, we can do this and there's not going to be any inflation, and that's what people took from it. Now, I know people said things that were more measured, like it might happen, we've got to do this. And I remember Stephanie saying, we got to get the CBO to score based on inflation. And, Rohan and Nathan and Scott Fulwiler wrote that article. I want to say it's in 2018, and I love the article. They didn't say it how Warren says it though. They did. I don't know if they said anything about the government is, setting prices. It's got to validate these prices. When a shortage happens, the government still has to choose to spend, choose to pay that price, and without that, there's no inflation. They didn't put it like that. And when people point out shortages, they're not wrong. When John says that inflation's, a measurement of, something going wrong, he's not wrong. And, Bill Mitchell's talking about class conflict and, all this stuff, labor versus capital. And, again, that's happening. Yeah, that's right. But still, there's this last final thing that has to happen. And it links all of these causes or these things happening in the private sector.
We collectively have to allow this to happen. We, as a collective, have to allow these things to happen.
Yeah.
Monopoly as a price setter, we have to choose to set that price or passively delegate that to somebody else. Or
we burn the economy to the ground.
Right.
and refuse to spend until prices fall. And which is, I love Warren's extreme examples. I don't know if you saw, he posted about like ending the Ukraine war, and he's like, "Yep, we'll just invite Russia to become part of the United States." I was like, "What the hell? Like that's the craziest idea I've ever heard of," and it would work, right? Like,
it's a great thought experiment.
Yeah, but he doesn't even like repeating that because it's so crazy. But yeah, I think we've seen we could have scored some more points, and maybe actually implemented better policy during this inflation run-up. If we had a better language and discussed it a lot better. And again, not that the way Stephanie says it is wrong, or we'd be in a worse place without her writings and her new blog and the lens and all that. But it's still a battle we're going to have to keep fighting until, things cool off a bit, and hopefully they are. So long as Saudis keep oil prices trading where they're at right now, the worst hopefully is behind us. But I feel like we were so close, and then the inflation sort of MMT was all over TV in 2020. Stephanie was on CNBC every 5 minutes. It seemed like, and nobody could keep up with all of her media appearances. And then Pavlina started, getting more, and it was just everywhere all the time, and article. And the powers that be, whatever, the conservatives, they were doing everything they could to, post negative articles, just total crap, stuff we've been arguing about for 20 years, the blog wars and second, third hand accounts of MMT sort of informing these written articles, the Republicans passing resolutions condemning MMT, which really pissed me off. House, and I think they did it twice in the Senate, and then once in the House, I think. And that Georgia senator, the David Perdue, he one who lost his election. I don't know, the Warnock, or I can't remember which Georgia senator replaced him, but he was an author of one of those in the Senate. And they were trying to do to MMT what they ended up doing to CRT, right? Making it the left's boogeyman. But I don't think that it's not, CRT is more people pay attention to that than really paid attention to MMT, right? So I don't know if it really worked, but we're losing John Yarmuth now in the House. Stephanie tells us, like, yep, I've talked to all these people. They understand, they get it. But, we're dealing with politics here. And I was hoping before John Yarmuth leaves, he would call like some meeting and bring him up to Congress and let Warren testify and explain all this. It'll take, 2-3 hour hearing. And Randy Ray's been there. That was Yarmuth invited him, right?
Was it Yarmuth? Okay.
I think Stephanie said she was supposed to do it, but she couldn't, so she volunteered Randy Ray.
I interviewed. I had an interview with Dr. Ray on that.
Yeah, your stuff is great, man. I was looking at some of your website. I didn't realize how long you've been at this. I was looking for an article about when Ray and Mosler met Kucinich, and it was funny. I found your web because you wrote about it and did the interview about it. And
not about that. Not about that. I talked to him. Dr. Ray told me that at the Levy summer session.
Oh, okay. But you wrote something about the monetary
reform, but nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, I just mentioned Kucinich just because of the Need Act, but otherwise.
Yeah, I know. And Kucinich was a kind of a weird guy, interesting guy. You know, he's mayor, fought off the mafia. A short little guy, had a hot redhead wife. I forget her name, but I saw pictures. I was like, holy crap, man! You know, there's hope for a guy like me. And but he was like the left's version of Ron Paul, and that Need Act was just insane. You know, like you know, and inflation is, you know, obviously an area of concern for MMT and just getting the movement out and getting people to understand the stuff. But my first roadblock was the banking system. I just loans create deposits? What the hell are you talking about? Like, and I was all worried. Like, I thought we lent to banks and then banks bought this, basically gave free money to the banks, and we do, but not like that. And I was all concerned about that. And I was like, I think, and you know, Warren's a rich guy, right? He's not a billionaire. But not if he sold everything in that day, it wouldn't be worth that much. But I kept, you know, getting worried that, you know, he's trying to get one over on us, or he's trying to enrich himself, you know, when I first met him, right? And it took a while, you know, to kind of realize this guy is more like a priest. You know, he's Warren helped me not just understand, but how to behave, how to act. And a couple weeks ago, I was getting kind of rowdy, and he's like, Charles, be the Pope. And you know, and I've talked about this in the past, how, you know, there's some toxic elements in our movement, you know, online. You know, some of the stuff people just got to get over being butthurt, but we do need to work on how we talk and treat each other, especially, you know, believe within the MMT movement. And I've talked about that in the past. I banned myself from my own group for a week because I thought I got rowdy. And but, you know, now I've got this 11th commandment. I am not going to speak ill of anyone that is supportive of this. You know,
not in public.
Hasn't always been true. You know,
not in public. I mean, you need to say what you need to say, but you don't necessarily need to say it in public in certain contexts.
Yeah,
I mean, John makes a huge point. Yeah, there are some disagreements, but we're on the same side in general, and you don't fight, you know, when we're already the underdog by far. I mean, you can talk in private, certainly, but you don't say these things in public, you know.
That becomes now what the fighting is, what people are talking about, and what, you know, instead of the subject matter that led to it, right? And, you know, so, but yeah, another thing I'd mentioned that I think is kind of cool and kind of funny is sometimes, like, happened a couple months ago, Stephanie emails me. It's almost like I become a proxy for like their version of like the MMT activists. And she's just like assumes like I'm the one that took this photo, or I'm the one that started it. I'm like, I don't. She was asking me to find the photo of Krugman meeting with graduate students, and they gave them Warren's book. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I had nothing to do with this. It's not me. You know what? And Matthew Forstater has done the same before. He's like, yeah, you're the first MMT activist. I'm like, no, I'm not. Like, well, you're the first one I remember on Facebook. And I'm like, okay, but there were people on Facebook at the time that I was talking to learn this stuff. So it can't be the first. And what, I don't even check on the group anymore. It's not what it used to be. It used to be a place where we really, there were some serious policy discussions on Facebook, and now I think the intro to MMT page might be the biggest one, because it's open to the public, but you get all these trolls coming in there and talk shit.
I mod that group, so
Yeah, and yeah, but like, I didn't intend to get involved at this level. I never, and I thought it would be easy. Like, okay, we'll just spread the word and everyone gets it, and then we'll start to adapt. And Warren had the same idea. He's like, he told Randy Gray when they first started, like, oh, we're going to win the Nobel Prize. And Randy Gray's like, no, we're not. No, we're gonna be fighting about this forever. And but and then we've got this administration here that is filled with a bunch of magical interest rate theorists and exporters. And exporters have just dominated U.S. policymaking, since the Obama era, at least, and maybe before. And they have way too much say in domestic policy choices, and the magical interest rate theory people. They have no evidence for anything that they're claiming. And Warren's the one that's been pointing this out. Is the Fed has $100 million research budget. You'd think they'd have one study that Jerome Powell could point to say, like, yeah, if we raise rates, it's gonna, the evidence shows that
yeah, they know the evidence is not going to show that, so they're not going to do the study.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there are studies that prove the opposite, though, that they've published.
Yeah. I want to go back to. I want to ask a final question, going back to something you said a while ago, and it's kind of a broad question. I just want to say kind of my opinion on it, and then get your thoughts on it. You were saying, like, the CPI is a measurement of prices in the past. And they do it well, and it's a hard thing to do, and they choose the basket of goods, and we have good data here in the U.S. in some senses, and so the CPI is a major measurement of inflation, of how we judge, it's a major thing that we point to determine whether or not we have inflation, but it's only in the past. It only tells us about prices in the past. Obviously, we cannot predict the future. And you were also saying of what are the real problems out there? What are the real problems that we're facing? Because, again, the thermometer is measuring the temperature of the patient. He's fighting off something, but we have no idea what. But all we focus on is the measurements of that thermometer, which are in the past, and the sickness has evolved since we took that measurement. So it's like, I keep going back to this analogy of, it's like we're analyzing the report cards of kids and making it into statistical graphs and stuff, and we're looking at the grades of these kids from the past, and that's the only thing that we use to judge the economy. When meanwhile, all of these kids, their lives have evolved since then. And if they have problems or sickness or abuse or anything negative, those things have evolved since those report cards came out, which we are then filtering through our measurements and whatever, and our regression and graphs and whatever. And it's like, so why do we spend so much time analyzing these prices in the past instead of just talking to the freaking kid? Just talk to the kid. What's the problems in the real world that are driving those grades, that are driving those prices? It's things in the real world. So go out into the real world and determine what these problems are. And if we solve these problems, then who cares what the CPI is? Because we know it's going to get better. We know it's going to get better. So stop focusing so hard on these statistics and these prices and the grades of these kids and the thermometer measurement of this sickness. Go out into the real world. Go and deal with this sick person and figure out what's wrong with him. Go and talk with these kids and figure out what problems they have and solve those problems, which will then obviously cure those prices, cure that temperature, and cure those grades.
Yeah, it's focus on the real. One thing Warren told me when I met him was, I don't exactly remember the full context, but he's like, take the money out. He's like, look at the economy, look at the real stuff, take the money out. And I'm like, whoa, like mind blown. And Stephanie's writings, about MMT. I mean, I don't know how. I mean, the woman, she look at the real economy, the real economy. And I think that is really that message gets home to people. Like, what is real conditions? And don't target a budget balance, target full employment and price stability, and what the budget balance is what it is. And price stability is not just, I guess maybe this is the last thing that I'll say, but price stability is not just inflation control, because again, you could have stable prices, stable inflation, aggregate, all the aggregates are stable, there's no inflation, and yet these relative price changes can hurt people. And we know, like, the way when people talk about inflation, they're not actually talking about what we define as inflation. They're, the prices have gone up. Oh my gosh, it's inflation. So we really got to focus more about how inflation is experienced. And that is maybe more important than these academic definitions that we're discussing and trying to, make policy with. And
it's exactly what you're saying. It's like, oh, inflation. Are you going to buy a used car? Are you planning on buying a used car in the next 6 months? No.
Yeah.
Well, then what the hell are you talking about? What do you care about inflation? Because it's all used cars right now. But they're still focused on this boogeyman.
Yeah. And our data is good. I don't want to imply that, the statisticians that work for the U.S. government and the other agencies, that they're corrupt or they're politically motivated. But they have a really hard freaking job. And over time, mistakes are going to be made. They're not perfect. No one's perfect, right? So we know that there's going to be some corruption in our data, and hopefully through these revisions, we can get closer to the truth. But, by including used cars in this basket of goods and then saying, oh, the whole basket's gone up, that leads to strange things. And then the media, inflation's, what, and, it's foolishness. And now with the Fed raising rates, which they threatened to do, like, inflation started ticking up, a little bit before the energy prices started to go up. But the Fed was just jawboning, talking about raising rates in the future. And that it's going to have negative consequences, and both on not just price level, but inequality too. You're giving basic income to rich people, to people who already have money in proportion to the money they have. And as Warren's pointed out, I don't think he says this, but there is a theory called fiscal dominance, where it basically, and it's a mainstream thing, and it's like once the national debt gets so high, raising rates can't cool the economy off anymore, because you're going to be adding all this income. And
right.
Warren has that extreme example where he's like, hey, just, thought experiment here, guys. What if they raise rates to 100%? So the national debt doubles in a year. So we go from 30 to $60 trillion. Is that going to be deflationary? And it's like, well, no one's going to borrow at 100%. Well, even if no one borrows, that's still going to be massively inflationary. It will be worse if people borrow, but it's still hard to keep consistent with the language, even for me, when I'm talking about inflation. Because it's the way I just said that, it sounds like I'm implying that inflation is still something in the private sector that's so it's an easy thing to muddy and screw up and confuse, and got to have grace. And it's not an attack the way, I don't want anyone to think like I'm, attacking someone through this criticism that I have. And again, I think a lot of it comes down to, the way academics talk is going to be different than the way I talk. I have a master's, but I'm not an academic. I'm basically a street person, really. I mean, before, I was a street protester. I went to before Warren visited with us, I was at the 2012 Texas Republican Convention. And I was in the street and I had a sign, government deficit equals non-government surplus. There was a guy that came up to me. He was a high-level Republican in the state of Texas. Not an elected official, but a businessman. And he's like, "You're right. I remember this. And we've really got to make a choice between Obama stimulus and Romney austerity. And I think you're right. We can't be doing what we're planning to do here." And Paul Ryan was there. We chased him in the street. And then another protest that I'm kind of proud of is on tax day 2013, I think. We showed up at the city shareholder meeting, which was in Irving. And I made a sign, the best way to rob a bank is to own one.
Uh-huh.
And I had the fraud recipe written on it. And we were talking to the city shareholders. They came out and wanted to talk to us. And I'm with hippies. We're what our intent was fairly obvious. But they still came out and talked to us. And we were like, look, you're about to approve ridiculous executive compensation for people that have destroyed the company and the stock and committed fraud. And we leave. No, we didn't leave. I had to leave, but people stayed the whole meeting. And at the end, they come out and they rejected the compensation plan. And some of the shareholders came up to us and were like, "Yeah, you thank you for being here. You helped us embolden." Because most of the time they're rubber stamps. They don't, which is funny. Shareholders typically just approve whatever the board proposes. They don't typically reject it. It's happened quite a few times, but historically with City, that was never the case. But they came out and thanked us, and I was like, "Holy shit!" Like, yeah, there's power in protest, And if you're reasoned and you're logical and you can explain yourself and you come correct. There's a lot we can do by protesting, by the act, the video stuff. And I'm just so proud of, the people like you, real progressives. There's so many now. There's so many others that I can't even think of them all. And, I remember when, I looked up and I could count on my hand the people that I knew in Dallas, Fort Worth that could follow what I was talking about. And it was me, John Harvey, and Timothy Wonder. Mm-hmm. And now I found a guy in my own high school. He graduated after me, Dustin. And so it's spread so far, so wide. Warren, he's like, it's like spreading like wildfire. So yeah, hopefully we're at least sometime in my lifetime. There's some real movement. Maybe, a job guarantee. I don't see that happening the next round of elections, or I worry we're the last days of the American Republic, basically. And I think I don't know what role this knowledge is going to play in politically in the 2022 races or the 2024 races. I don't think it has. I don't think we're going to have much say. We're going to have to get someone elected who understands this stuff before they run for office. And I think Stephanie needs to try to run for office. I know she tried in Kansas in the state house, or Missouri, I think. But I think she would be the number one pick, right? Warren's never going to run again. He's ran office like 5 times and lost every time. It's super frustrating for him.
But there's a couple other people I know in Texas. 3 other people I know in Texas.
Sam Levy, now Jonathan
Wilson.
Yeah, there was Ryan in Austin. He's
Ryan. Yeah, he's I think really dived into school.
Yeah. There is like a Texas,
and Bill Peoples too.
Okay, but pisses me. All these people live in Houston and Austin. I'm like, there is like a Texas deficit owl group. I think Sam Levy created it before I kind of knew who he was, but I love his mathematical model paper.
One of the person in Texas, he's from Texas, is Andres Bernal.
Yeah. He lived in the. I think his family still lives in like McAllen, and my mother lives in Farr. I actually lived there for 9 months in the early aughts, before I learned about MMT. Yeah, Andres is another person maybe to throw up there to, run for office, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we are seeing more candidates that are coming to the activists and doing interviews, running for office, talking about MMT concepts. But I've done, what do you call it, campaigning, right? And they had to train me because I'm sitting here trying to argue with people in the street. And they're like, what are you doing? Why are you wasting all this time? Go find people that agree. And, and I think that's the left's, are more left-wing MMTers. They're all about getting out the vote, people that already agree or are more likely to agree. And that is the right way to do it. But if you can peel off some opposition, you make your job a little easier on the other front. And, and that's why I'd really like to get more involved in speaking, to moderates and conservatives, non-Nazi conservatives, which, when I see it, I know I'm like, oh, okay, cool. I can talk to this person.
Hate is not the core of who they are.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's like, we got to have more grace with people. I mean, not with Nazis, Nazis get the lead, but, and then you have a line, and we have a problem with just everyone's outraged over everything and nobody's doing a damn thing about anything. Everyone is just bitching. And politically, we have this problem where the Democrats are seen as complainers, as whiners. Republicans are seen as doers, as winners. And I think that dynamic will attract, that deters people from really listening to what the Democrats have to say and things, the way they can positively affect people's lives. And they turn to the Republicans who are just spouting nonsense, right? But, they're annoyed by something related to the left. And, it doesn't take much for them to throw the baby out with bathwater, I suppose, right? And even though, like, you poll these people, you ask them, do you support Medicare for all? Yes. You support legalization of marijuana? Yes. Are you for legal abortion? Yes, I'm okay with abortion. And then the same people will vote for Republicans that are totally against all those policies, That's a disconnect, and we got to look.
I don't think it's a disconnect. They don't have anyone to vote for. There's no one good to vote for.
Yeah.
Those who are good to vote for are shut out before they, it ever gets to that point.
Well, yeah, and and Democrats are just love to lose, and browbeat their own side, and this lady running for Congress against Jim Jordan in Ohio, she wrote this just diatribe on Twitter about blaming people for not voting and just hostile. And it's like, dude, have you ever done sales? Like, you don't, I've never made a sale. I've never recruited a candidate or got a contract by being mean to my freaking client or candidate. She's a paralegal, that's what her former occupation was. I was like, man, I don't know. Like, I used to say, like, all adults need to go wait tables. It's like all Democrats need to get a sales job or try to sell before they get into politics, because you wouldn't say that. And I'm you could say I'm a vote blue no matter who guy. I hate saying that, but I look at this Trumpers and the Republican Party as like the harbingers of a Nazi regime that's coming, right? And you got to go to war.
It's 2 steps away from that. Vote blue no matter who keeps us 2 steps away from that. But why don't we be 100 steps away from that?
And that's in the primary season and in the leading up to elections, like develop other alternatives to this bullshit. And I'm totally okay with that. Ranked choice voting. But there are people that just like, no, we need to lose. We need to just burn this thing to the ground. We need to let the Nazis take power. I'm like, what the hell? Like, no way in hell I'm allowing that, But yeah, Jesus. So yeah, I mean, but when vote blue, no matter who, I mean, there are limits to that, right? Like, I can see some races where it's like, all right, screw this. I'm not voting for this guy. I'll tolerate, this Republican, versus this idiot. And, but yeah, I don't understand the whole, let's burn it down. Let's lose. let's give them more power, and somehow we will, rise from the ashes out of that.
No, it's just desperation. You drive people to desperation, they're going to act desperately. That's just an expression of them acting desperately. You can't, whatever. But
you're not going to win those people over by browbeating them and yelling and screaming at them like these idiots that lady running for Congress against Jim Jordan did. I mean,
of course.
Like, have some fucking empathy for people and some sympathy, grace.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm kind of trailing off here, man. This has been great. It's almost like 10:40 now.
Yep, it's time to go.
Run. I can hear my daughter. I'm see if my wife needs some help, but
it's been great, and the papers that you had me read were really interesting.
Sweet.
I'll link them.
I hope I've done well. I'm really nervous about public speaking, and it's kind of a challenge for me, which is why I try to do these things.
It is for me too, and that's why I have this podcast, to be honest.
Yeah, I've always seen myself as like a behind the scenes guy. Never my thing to like be out in front. And but anyways, yeah, Jeff, man, thank you, man. I appreciate that. And
no problem. Thanks so much for coming on. It's been really interesting, and it's been good.
And, all right, man. Anyways, yeah, man, you take care. You be safe.
Charles, thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely, bro. All right, man. Take care.
Music for this show is by RecTech. You can find RecTech on SoundCloud and Spotify at WRECK_TECH. To record Activist MMT, I use the iOS phone app Tape-A-Call Plus for recording phone calls and Zencaster for internet-based recordings. My post-production workflow starts by editing on the iOS app AnyTune Pro Plus, then transferring those timestamps to my Windows desktop. At that point, I crudely process the audio in Audacity and then implement the edits and do all of the final processing in the Reaper digital audio workstation. Activist MMT is hosted by Libsyn, and the video teasers are created with the online Headliner app. Today's part 2 of my 2-part conversation with Charles Hayden. In part 1, Charles described how he created at least 3 important milestones in MMT history, and how Warren Mosler played an integral role in his journey to understanding and accepting MMT. Today in part 2, we discuss some of the many varied realistic views of inflation, and how each of them is connected by the fact that the national government is the monopoly price setter for the entire economy, whether they know it or not. This is one of the unique contributions of modern money theory. The first realistic view of inflation is how it's not a disease or a symptom, but rather a measurement of some prices going up somewhere in the economy for some reason. It's not possible to know what the problem is without going out into the real world and discovering them for yourself. If you address those real world problems, then those prices will naturally go down, which will in turn result in a lower measurement of inflation. This is not unlike how a thermometer measures the temperature of a sick person. The rabid desire to lower inflation is not unlike dunking the thermometer into a cup of ice and ignoring the actual sickness of the actual patient and doing nothing to help them. This is the idea behind lowering inflation by raising interest rates. If we lock all of the starving people out of the kitchen, then we can truthfully say that everyone who enters this kitchen gets a good meal. These are all examples of how real costs are pushed by those with the most onto those with the least, and subsequently onto the families and communities in which those people exist. The second realistic view of inflation is the class conflict theory of inflation. This is as originated by Marx and adopted by MMT. Inflation is essentially a battle between business owners and their workers, where one side fights to increase their profits and the other to increase their wages. A wage price spiral can only happen if we allow it to happen. The only way it can stop is if one side is empowered enough to prevent the other from pushing back. More broadly, this is the centuries-long battle between rich and poor to increase their power over the other. In all the above cases, outside of natural catastrophe, the government must be complicit in order for the inflation to persist. Currently, the government is essentially entirely on the side of the rich, business owners, and capitalists. So in almost all cases, all real and financial costs are borne by workers and the poor. The idea that the government is the monopoly price setter essentially means to me that we as a collective are in control of our own destiny. The government is us as a collective. We have let it decay into the morass that it currently is. We have let the leash out way too far, and now it's going to take a whole lot of effort in order to rein it back in. Regardless, no matter how unlikely or even impossible the task may be, if we are to survive, there is no alternative. Outside of natural disaster, everything we do and don't do is a choice. We are choosing to go extinct. We could choose to not do that. And now, let's get right back to my conversation with Charles Hayden. Enjoy.